Hello, this is James Page for Sat TV, and as you may notice, I'm on stage in the Tech Theatre here in Washington at Satellite 2025, and that's because we've just finished a really interesting session on generative AI and its role in the ground segment, and one of the key speakers from that debate is Thorsten Stremlau. Thorsten, from NVIDIA in your day job, but here also on behalf of Trusted Computing Group. Thank you for sitting down with Sat TV for a minute.
Thank you, James. It was a pleasure.
It was a really interesting session, and some of the discussion afterwards was suggesting maybe there's a little bit more maturity in the discussion about AI and where it fits into the satellite world and in the ground segment especially. What sort of things are you thinking where generative AI is actually really helping?
Well, there's so many different areas that Gen AI is helping today. I'll start off with the simplest one, right? Really, with the simplest one, which is really helping technicians, engineers, and the operators interact with technical manuals, right? So we have thousands and thousands of pages of technical manuals that instruct you on how to operate all the equipment, which configuration to take part, and everything else like that. And familiarizing yourself with those things, familiarizing yourself with any changes that are made to those documents is something that is a lot of work, right? And so that is probably the first entry point for a lot of companies today, is simply to take those manuals, to take that data and feed it into a local LLM or feed it into a cloud-based LLM, typically local because they want to keep that data, on their local network, and then have their technicians, their engineers, and their operators interact with that. So naturally be able to ask questions, which switch do I pull in order to turn this on and off? Which port do I turn on and off, and what are the implications to my security? Those are the different types of things that you can ask the Gen AI based on your documents. But then we go into other different types of areas as well. So that's the lowest one. That's probably going to be your easiest area of entry. We then go into things like, for example, end user interaction, right? So chatbots, instead of having a human operator that now has to answer the emails or the telephone calls, you can now also have a Gen AI be able to answer those early queries, right? And then so to again, reduce the amount of human impact that it has and really reserve the humans for when real full skill is needed or something more manual intervention is needed. That would be the second level. Then we start getting into a little bit more of the complex stuff, which is now where we look at analyzing all of the data, being able to predict network outages, failovers, best network segments, cost implications to using a satellite network, low Earth orbit networks, et cetera, and then basically changing your network configuration accordingly. That's also now, we're seeing a huge amount of that. To then grow a little bit further on that, and I'm growing and growing up here on the scale, and then, by the way, if we could take that, we can take the data that we've got and we can create a digital twin of the entire satellite ecosystem. So if I know this is the satellite, these are the characteristics of the satellite, I can also introduce weather information and other information into that digital twin. Now I have a really, really good way of now modeling my data just about everywhere, right? And I can see, there's a storm front coming up. It's going to impact this satellite, this satellite, this satellite. Therefore, I need to change my network configuration in a way. In the future, we're looking at a whole bunch of other things where I can now naturally interact with my satellite network and I can just basically talk to it and have it do my things rather than have to manually switch the switches. We're looking at adaptive beamforming, so that if a particular weather system moves in, I can actually change the characteristics of my signals in order to be able to penetrate and use what signals I do have left in a much, much better way in that interaction. So starting small, user manual interaction all the way out through really automating and being able to model all of the sat operations is that would be, I guess, the scope of where we are.
So massive upside potentially for the sector in terms of those sort of efficiencies and everything that we've just talked about. But part of the discussion on the stage as well was talking about some risks that are involved in that, and in terms of especially thinking about data and network security.
As with everything, there's positives and there's negatives. So, let's be very, very clear. As a satellite operator, I want to provide the best data service and the best transmission service, and for my customers and my end users that I have. However, there are also hackers that want to take a piece of that pie, either to just disrupt, to make the news, or, by the way, to be able to steal data or access certain information. And by the way, they're also leveraging Gen AI in order to come up with new innovative hacking techniques, in order to analyze particular signals, in order to analyze communications transactions, and leverage that data and identify patterns in the data that they can then leverage for their stuff, right?
So we've got a sort of arms race going on between the good guys and the bad guys.
Absolutely. And again, that is one of the negative side of things is with Gen AI, I am able to identify patterns. That's a positive thing. That's also a negative thing. And so it's important for satellite operators and ground segment operators to be aware of that and also be able to react more quickly to vulnerabilities in their environments before hackers are able to identify them.
Yeah. It was an interesting discussion, I think, and it could work for any particular industry, but I think you answered it on stage very well. So sort of asking you the same thing, there was a question about whether this was just going to replace everybody. And I think there was a consensus view, I would say, among the panel, but maybe that's not the case.
We're still a bit away from, generalized human intelligence in this space. It's called artificial intelligence for a particular reason. But today we really need to see AI as a companion for humans, right? It's an additional resource to use. I like to equate it back to, the first printable books, right? There was always the ability for humans to write out books by hand, and it took them hundreds of years in order to transcript a new Bible copy or whatever else, not necessarily hundreds of years, but decades in order to do that properly. And you'll remember those really, really, beautifully, painted versions of Bibles and old manuscripts. And then the printed book came along. And the printed book just basically meant that I could now mass produce and I could also mass disseminate knowledge. That caused a huge step in human evolution. And that's the same kind of thing that we're seeing now with Gen AI. It's not replacing humans at all. It's also not replacing, what we can do as humans, but it's augmenting what we can achieve in the time that we can achieve it. Because the one thing that Gen AI and AI is much, much better at than we are as humans is to identify patterns in large amounts of data. And that's going to be the critical and crucial part.
Yeah, I think with a lot of the technology can sometimes get blamed, whereas I think it's the person using the technology sometimes where we have to be wary of too. It's not going to go and do it itself.
That's right.
Okay, fantastic. So we're not going to be sat here next year with an AI version of Thorsten and hopefully not an AI journalist.
I hope it's going to be a more attractive version of me.
Okay, couldn't possibly. Thorsten, thank you so much for explaining some of that. It's a really interesting discussion and a great panel session. Thanks for talking to us.
Thank you, James.